Hello there, fellow humans, and instead of reviewing the brand new, not new, gambling tank right here, the BZ-176, which I only have one thing to say about, it's inferior to the ancient KPZ-70, as you can see. So this vehicle is an entirely waste of space and time, and if you didn't already waste all your money getting it in the event, you shouldn't waste your money and time on it now. And the rest of the shop is equally poor, with a bad tank at a bad price, a bad tank at a good price, a mediocre tank at a bad price, and a E25 that's about 2,000 gold too expensive. So nothing special in there. So what I'm going to do instead, as a useful thing to do, I'm going to go through every single vehicle in the game that is actually worth buying if it ever shows up in the shop, and roughly what price. Now, in terms of the pricing, 3,000 for a tier 7, 7,000 to 8,000 maximum for a great tier 8, 5,000 for a mediocre tier 8 like a T2065, then somewhere between 8 and 10,000 for a tier 9, and 15 to 17,500 for a decent tier 10, and 20,000 maximum for a excellent tier 10. So let's go through them. Obviously, we're not going to go through the lower tiers here because they're not worth purchasing unless you're a tank collector or you want to blow up tier 5s in a SU-100Y, for example. All of these tier 6 and lower vehicles don't have any value factor. They only have a collector factor and a fun factor, and honestly, that's the SU-100Y. Something like a Tiger 131 can be very enjoyable. The Cryos, obviously, if it ever comes back in the shop, is sort of a little bit OP. The Blastoid and the Tog must-haves, of course, but the rest of them aren't really worth it. So we're going to start with tier 7, and I have quite a lot of tier 7s. The one I'm missing is a T28 HTC, but luckily you don't want that anyway. And luckily you don't want a lot of these vehicles in the first place at all. Now, the only ones that are actually worth purchasing, something like a Skoda T54 was given away for free before, so I wouldn't buy it now, even though it is relatively good. The only ones worth purchasing really are the Dracula, if it's a good price. That is, again, below 6,000 gold, for example, for a special vehicle like that. And then the Annihilator and the Smasher. And the rest of them, maybe even the Lycan, if it's very cheap, that's also a very good vehicle. But the rest of them aren't really worth it to actually purchase for a large majority of the player base, because most of you want to have two things. You want to have credits and you want to have fun. For example, a Type 62, if it's sold for 3,000 gold and you love light tanks, is also a great pickup for that. But the rest of them aren't really worth it. Like KV-13, sure, it's special, it's rare, but you're not actually getting much from it, because here in this video I'm going to talk about what is actually the most worth it. Because if you want to collect tanks, you just get them all anyway, unless it's the Panther M10, because you're sort of devaluing your garage if you get a vehicle like this one or a Kunze Panzer, which are just entirely pointless. So the Eagle is often sold as well, and it's quite decent, so this is my secondary pickup, I guess, if you want a tier 7 medium tank. But the problem with tier 7 is that they make less damage and earn less credits than tier 8s, so if you want a tier 7, you might as well get a tier 8 anyway. So that's what we're going to get to now, and there is quite a lot of them. Luckily, it's very simple, because if you look at the light tanks, none of these are actually worth it for grinding credits. The HGBK is inferior to the IO251. The M4190 can be interesting, but isn't, and yeah, that's not a real tank. So yeah, you're not getting anything here. There is one further one that I don't have, but that one's not worth it either. I've tried it on my test account. So we go into the mediums, and that's also very easy to go through, because what we have here, STV81 was given away for free. It's a decent vehicle, so I wouldn't purchase it. Now, what we have here, none of the Americans are worth it. The Germans aren't worth it either. This one is quite overhyped, but it has a cupola. You can be penned in the lower plate quite easily. It is a gigantic target, and I don't really recommend it. The WT590 is probably the best out of these Soviet vehicles. Obviously, there's the 274A and the ST something that I don't have in my own garage either, but those aren't worth it. If you want a Soviet tier 8 medium tank, I highly recommend the Object 590 if it comes in the shop at a good price. The Centurion Mark 5-1 is a good vehicle that is definitely worth picking up at a decent price. So is the Chimera as well. Those are definitely worth it. Personally, wouldn't get the Defender Mark 1, but if you want a sort of low alpha damage autoloader alternative, then it can be a good alternative to the Centurion Mark 5-1 as well. Then I wouldn't get any of the Chinese ones. The 122 TM is relatively solid, but if you have the Chimera, you don't need the 122 TM whatsoever. The French ones, the Barasque is excellent, obviously. It does require you to be somewhat skilled, so definitely make sure to know what you're doing. If you get it, the Lorraine, the MX, AP, and the CDC aren't worth it, and neither are the others. The Regular Racer can be worth it if you're an expert player and you want a challenge, and so is the Lance and C. It is a tank for expert players that are looking for a challenge. Same with the Progetto and the Skoda, but they're not the primary credit earnings right there. It's not like a Titan, they're pointless. So basically, if you're a beginner to intermediary player, Chimera, Centurion, and Object 590, and if you're an advanced player, obviously Barask, M4, Lanson, Progettos, all those kind of things. I wouldn't really consider any of the other Soviets or the German tanks or the Americans either. Those just aren't really well performing, because remember one thing, remember the Pershing test. If a premium tank has worse performance or equal performance to the Pershing, why would you buy it? Then we got the tier 8 heavy tank, and here it becomes a little bit more complicated. For example, something like a T-34 is really old, but can still be worth it in certain instances if it's really cheap. Now, obviously, T-77 and T-54E2 are pretty much must-haves for every garage, and I highly recommend them. If the T-26E5 is available for very cheap, that is 5,000 gold, it can also be a worthy pickup, because it's sort of the heavy version of the Pershing. It's pretty solid, slightly better, it makes a lot of crits as well, so it can be worth it. The Löwe is not really a great tank, but it makes excellent credits, so if it is in the shop for a cheap price in a good bundle, for example the 5.5k gold bundle with 30 days of premium, then the Löwe can be a worthy pickup as well. Kyler E75TS are better vehicles than the Löwe, but they also make less credits because of their credit coefficient, so I would definitely recommend the Löwe. But if you really love the German style heavy tanks, then you can't really go wrong with either of these two. They pretty much play the same. The Kyler has a little bit better turret armor, and the E75TS is a little bit better all around, so it doesn't really matter which one of these two you get. They're gonna ultimately just fine. Their guns are pretty much the same, 2.3k DPM, 310 alpha damage, and on this one you got a little bit less DPM but a little bit more alpha damage. So again, if you want the turret armor, if you want a little bit more alpha damage, get the Kyler. If you don't mind that, get the E75TS for a little bit better all-round performance. Then the Object 2FTU, I used to recommend it a lot. I don't anymore, because it's old, and there are better vehicles out there, so I don't recommend any of these Soviet heavy tanks. Obviously, the KV-5 is still sort of a meme tank that can be worth it if you get it for very cheap. Then we have the Chieftain Titan 5, which can perform well in the hands of a really good player, but I personally don't recommend it generally. So, Caliban, it's a meme tank. You don't earn crits with this. It's like the SU-100Y of tier 8. You purchase this if you want to be obnoxious. You don't purchase this if you want to actually perform well. So, Charlemagne, again, it's a Hesh tank, so not really the best credit grinding vehicle. Don't really recommend it in that regard. Yeah, let's not talk about that. And then we have the Regular Action X, which is also somewhat overhyped. It's sort of like the M48 Rempanzer of heavy tanks, because it gets overhyped a lot, but it's not really that great, because 190 alpha damage on heavy tank, it's perfectly fine on a Centurion 5-1, but to have 190 alpha damage on a heavy tank, that is pretty much a deal breaker, so I definitely don't recommend that vehicle to the general Blitz player. But I definitely recommend the Type 57, because this one pretty much replaced the Object 250U, because it also has gun depression, and it is a very all-round, well-working vehicle, and it's also good for beginners. Not as great, not as well-rounded as a T-54E2, for example, but nonetheless a very decent vehicle as well. So I highly recommend the Type 57 to pick up as well. The 112-2, sort of like, it's good. Sort of like the best of the IS-3 style vehicles, but obviously if you have a Type 57 or a Skoda T56, you have no need for a 112-2 at all. And this one's also definitely worth it. It does have a very nice gun, performs quite well. Fortunately, it's only a single shot, which kind of loses a bit of its attractiveness. It should also be 2 shots now, like a 2-shot autoloader, like the VZ55. But I guess Wargaming doesn't want to have fun. Then both of the Frenchies. This one is sort of like the T26E5, where it's a solid vehicle. If it's very cheap, it can be worth it to sort of bolster your back end to, if your great tanks like the T77, T4A2, Type 57. If they're in battle, you can play this one. It's a backup vehicle that can be somewhat worth it. Then we have the ML951, which is quite solid, and I can recommend if you're a intermediate to advanced player because it sort of lacks turret armor compared to the regular ML, and while the regular ML is still a great vehicle, this one just doesn't really have the perfect hull down capabilities of the regular ML, so it is a little more difficult to play. But it does have the good performance, otherwise great gun, great mobility for a heavy tank of that sort, so I definitely recommend it if you're an advanced player and an autoloader fan. Then the Bizonte, well, it's a single shot gun with a cuck shell. If you don't know that name, the shell that you can't fire but can look at is called a cuck shell. Please establish that term further than it already is. So it's a solid vehicle, but I wouldn't recommend it primarily. And then we look at the tank destroyers, and there is only one thing to say, and that is get the 121 GFT and ignore the rest of them. However, if you don't already have this vehicle, and I definitely highly recommend picking this up if you're a tank destroyer fan. The Vipera can be okay as well. It plays more like a heavy than a tank destroyer, but it is a decent pickup as well. And then the other two are the Scorpion G and the SU-130 PM. Whichever one's cheaper is going to be the one that's more worth it, essentially, out of these two, because they basically trade performance. The Scorpion G has a little bit better all-round mobility because it can traverse the turret the entire way, but it's higher, so it has less camo rating, so you have to camp further back. But generally, if you want to camp, you always have to camp outside of your firing camouflage anyway, and here you have 7% concealment while firing, and on these SU you have 13, so that's the only big difference here, because obviously if you're camping at the back, you also want to shoot, so if you are camping, you want to camp so that your shooting camo rating is active. The rest of them, I mean, the Jagdtiger, it's sort of a collector item. The gun is really good, like 3,400 DPM on this thing, 350 alpha damage. Make sure to actually use the good one instead of the old one. And if you have this vehicle, but generally, it's not really worth having, but it's a decent vehicle. Anyway, so Scorpion G, SU-130 if you want to camp at the back, WZ-121 GFT if you want to do everything else, and if you want a heavy tank that also pretends to be a tank destroyer, the SMV Vipera. And, well, then we go to Tier 9, and Tier 9's relatively easy because there is not a lot of tanks, and I don't have all of them. Something like a WZ-114, for example. I've made videos about those kind of vehicles. They aren't really worth anything. The Tier 9s are sort of like Tier 7s, where you can get more damage in Tier 10 and you get more credits in Tier 8. So you only really have to have a great vehicle here to make it worth it. Now the Cape is at 70, which is, as already mentioned earlier, superior to the good old BZ-176, which doesn't make it good though, because it's a mediocre vehicle, just like the TL7, which are both fine, but that's not good enough. The 452K is also fine, but it's not good enough. The Kennedy 1 is definitely good enough, and I definitely recommend it. And the Object 752 is, if you buy one Tier 9, make it this one, because it is quite an excellent vehicle right there. And obviously the Kennedy 1 is slightly worse than the Object, but most of the time it is quite a bit cheaper. So if you don't have all the credits to afford that, then it is also a great option. So these two Soviet autoloaders right here are excellent, and pretty much the only ones I recommend picking up. The Shaficho, if you're an excellent expert player, if you really know what you're doing, you can make use of this thing. The MX-30 as well. So it depends really. Do you want the versatility of the MX-30 and the useful turret armor, or do you want the better gun and mobility of the Shaficho? Well, actually it's not. Hold on. This vehicle is actually slower than the MX-30. I apologize for misremembering. If you want the better gun, get the Shaficho. If you want the better vehicle, then get the MX-30 and the 50. I mean, it's fine. It's good. 50 TP prototype. But it's not really worth purchasing because it's too similar to the Tech Tree 50 TP. And the 55A, do really have to say it, don't buy it. And then we get to Tier 10, and there was no light tanks. So there was only 3 tank destroyers, only one of them worth it. That is the Badger. The Object, it's not that good. Like, it can work really well, and it's one of the very few vehicles where you can't pen the lower plate. But in turn, if you turn the vehicle like about this, you can pen this side plate right here. So it's very easy to defeat. And the only Tier 10 tank destroyer I would actually recommend is the Badger. Because the XM66F, it pretends to be a heavy tank, but it's not. And I don't recommend it for that. Then, the medium tanks. Right here. Well, KP-50. It's great. Get it. Ignore the others. That's my advice right here. The MX-30B used to be terrible. It got buffed. Now it is quite good as well. So if you're an expert player, I can recommend that to expert players. But generally, the only Tier 10 medium premium that is actually worth it is the KPZ 50T, because it basically makes something like a 907 or a 121B relatively pointless to have if you already have this one. The M60 doesn't make creds, is the same as the M48 pattern, so unless you get it for free, do not purchase that vehicle whatsoever. And the Coro 45T is essentially inferior to the Progetto, so why would you downgrade, pretty much? So KPZ 50T if you're anyone, and MX-30B if you're an expert player. And if you really love not having gun depression, or if you're a big fan of the 62A, the T22 medium can be a secondary option right there. But I wouldn't purchase any of the other ones. And then we go to the final category, and that's the heavy tanks. Concept 1B, must have. This is the essentially now T54E2 of tier 10. And I can highly recommend the Concept 1B to pretty much anyone. The T95E6 is a very good vehicle if you are a very good player as well. Do not buy this if you're a beginner or intermediate player, but if you're a advanced player of like 55% win rate plus and, I don't know, 20,000 battles, something like that, that's what I would classify as advanced, then it could be a worthy pickup. It's most often very cheap, so it can be worth it for that as well. The VK90, great tank, easy to play as well. Can side scrape really well. The only thing you obviously have to deal with is the turret at the back, so you will need to learn how to sort of maneuver this vehicle around corners, but outside of that, it is a vehicle well worth getting. So Concept 1B, VK90, definitely worth it if they're under 20,000. The 777, if you really love the 113, and only if you really love the 113, then the 777 is a good pickup as well. But if you don't own the 113, and you don't like the 113, don't buy the 777. Basically, that's my advice towards this vehicle. Super Conqueror, I dislike very much. I just have to put this in here. I really dislike that this is the default screen. Like, every time you click on the thing, you have to click again to get to the actual important things, to the things that actually matter. And that's not going to get any better in Reforged, because Wargaming is now going to hide all of these behind another menu. So fix your menus, Wargaming. But yeah, essentially, this tank, it could be better. The aim time is not really that great. It has 10 degrees of gun depression, 0.29 accuracy, which is very lovely. But this thing, it lacks that little bit of something. Like, if you compare it to the Concept 1B, it is quite large, if you look at it. So, compared to the Concept 1B, it is a little bit worse. Not by much, but a little bit. So, let's say the Super Conqueror costs 15k, the Concept costs 20, get the Super Conqueror. But generally, this is a secondary option right here. I would recommend the Concept over it. Then the Chieftain, it has Hesh now, which is not great, and unfortunately I would not recommend this vehicle anymore unless you're a advanced player. Then you can deal with the Hesh. It's also not really that great for making creds anymore, because obviously the Hesh is very expensive, so you're not going to have a great time with that, and I just don't recommend it anymore unless you're a advanced player right there. 114 SP is a waste of space, so is the 5A. The MX M4 MLE has its upsides, but it is a massive vehicle with not really an outstanding profile otherwise in terms of gun and mobility, so I wouldn't recommend it. And the SCVK, it's sort of like the middle piece between a T95 and the Concept 1B, and I also only would recommend it to advanced players. That's pretty much how I would see everything that's in the shop right now. And obviously all the vehicles that I didn't talk about that I don't have, it's just like 10 or something like that. I don't have them, you shouldn't either. So what do you think? Do you recommend the same tanks? Do you recommend the different tanks? Would you never recommend the tanks that I'm recommending? Or would you recommend the M60 to everybody? Or did I make any further mistakes than confusing the MX and show if you chose mobility? Put it down in the comments